In the dead of winter in 1875, when the wind seemed determined to erase every last trace of life, a woman living alone heard children crying somewhere beyond the wall of snow. That sound would change her life forever. Thank you for joining us. When the story ends, tell us in the comments whether you enjoyed it, where you are watching from, and what brought you to this story today. The winter of 1875 had struck the Texas frontier with unusual cruelty. Martha Wilkins, a 30-year-old widow, lived alone in a small cabin near the Brazos River. She had arrived from Cincinnati, Ohio, 3 years earlier with her husband, but he had died of fever soon afterward. Although neighbors from the nearby settlement repeatedly urged her to return east, Martha refused to leave. Life was hard, but on that lonely stretch of land, she had found a kind of peace she had never known amid the noise and crowded streets of Cincinnati. On that January morning, the sky turned the heavy lead gray color Martha knew all too well. A storm was coming. She went outside early to gather extra firewood, secure her supplies, and inspect the small farm. Her 3 cows and handful of chickens were safely sheltered in the barn. Once everything was ready, she lit a fire in the hearth and sat down to mend clothing as the first force of the storm began to gather. The wind soon howled with savage fury, bending the pine trees that surrounded her property. Snow fell in thick flakes and within minutes formed a white curtain, so dense that Martha could see only a few steps beyond the windows. She was accustomed to frontier storms, but this one felt different, more violent, more merciless, as though winter itself had come to prove its strength. Near noon, just as she was about to prepare chicken broth, Martha heard a strange sound beneath the roar of the wind. At first, she thought her imagination was playing tricks on her. Then the sound came again. It sounded like crying. "Is someone out there?" she called, even though she knew no one beyond the cabin could possibly hear her. The crying continued. Uneasy and increasingly alarmed, Martha pulled on her thick wool coat, wrapped a scarf around her head, and forced herself to open the door. A blast of wind nearly knocked her backward, but she gripped the frame and stepped into the storm. "Hello. Is anyone there?" she shouted with all the strength she had. The sound seemed to come from the west side of the cabin. Martha pushed forward with enormous effort, her boots sinking into snow that already reached her knees. When she rounded the corner, she made out 2 small shapes huddled against the wall. They were children. They wore almost no protection from the cold, and both were shaking uncontrollably. "Oh, dear God," Martha gasped as she hurried toward them. Their features and long black hair made it clear that they were Comanche. A boy of about 8 years old had wrapped himself around a younger girl, perhaps 5, trying to shield her with his own body. Both children had lips that had turned blue from the cold. Martha did not waste a second. She lifted the little girl into her arms, caught the boy by the hand, and pulled them toward the cabin. "Come with me." Quickly, she said, though she had no idea whether they understood English. Once inside, she brought them directly to the fire. They trembled so violently that Martha feared she had found them too late. The children stared at her with a mixture of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. The older boy looked ready to bolt at the slightest movement. "You are safe," Martha said gently. "I am not going to hurt you." She found clean blankets and began removing their soaked clothing. Beneath the snow and mud, she recognized the traditional leather garments worn by the Comanche. How had 2 children ended up alone on her land in the middle of such a deadly storm? The boy murmured something in his own language, but Martha could not understand him. During her years on the frontier, she had learned a few Comanche words from traders and travelers, though nowhere near enough to hold a conversation. "My name is Martha," she said, touching her chest. "What are your names?" The boy hesitated. At last, he pointed to himself. "Tasha's." Then he pointed to the little girl. "Nomi." Martha smiled. Tasha's and Nomi. All right. Now you both need something warm to eat. As she heated the broth, she could not stop wondering what the children had been doing alone in the snow. The Comanche were renowned for surviving the harshest conditions on the plains, but these were not warriors or experienced scouts. They were only children, and this storm would have challenged even the strongest men. Martha poured the broth into wooden bowls and sat across from them. Both children ate desperately, especially Tasha's. Little Nomi could barely hold her spoon. Her hands were still shaking. "Where did you come from?" Martha asked, using gestures to support her words. "Where is your family?" Tasha's looked toward the window, pointed west, and spoke several words Martha could not understand. Then he moved one hand as though he were riding a horse. "You came a long way on horseback," she guessed. The boy nodded. "Where is the horse?" Tasha's lowered his head. Martha realized they had lost the animal, probably after it panicked in the storm. Without an adult strong enough to control it, the children had been left stranded and helpless. When they finished eating, Martha made a place for them to sleep beside the fireplace. Nomi fell asleep almost immediately, but Tasha's remained awake and watchful, studying every corner, as though he feared something terrible might still happen. "You can stay here until the storm passes," Martha told him. "After that, we will find your family." Night settled over the cabin, yet the blizzard showed no sign of weakening. Martha stayed near the fire, watching the children and wondering who they were, how they had reached her home, and most of all, who might be searching for them. 3 days passed. The storm continued, though with less force. During that time, Martha and the children developed a simple way to communicate. Tasha's proved intelligent and remarkably observant, quickly understanding many of Martha's gestures. Nomi remained shy, but little by little she began to smile whenever Martha sang to her, or showed her how to knead bread dough. Martha learned that the children belonged to a Comanche band camped several days' journey to the west. They had gone hunting with their uncle when the storm overtook them. Their horse panicked, the children fell, and in the confusion they became separated from the adult. They had wandered for hours before finding Martha's cabin. "Your father must be terribly worried," Martha said to Tasha's, even though she knew he understood only part of what she was saying. "Father warrior," the boy replied proudly, raising one arm as though he held a spear. "Strong." Martha nodded. She knew the reputation of Comanche warriors. Across the frontier, they were feared for their ferocity, and for their extraordinary skill on horseback. Yet in recent years, many bands had been forced onto reservations, and tension between settlers and native peoples remained dangerously high. On the 4th day, the storm finally ended. Sunlight blazed across a completely white landscape, so bright that it hurt the eyes. Martha stepped outside to inspect the damage. The barn had survived and the animals were safe, but in some places the snow stood nearly 3 feet deep, making travel almost impossible. As she studied the plains, Tasha's came outside and stood beside her. He pointed west. "Father will come," he said in English. Martha turned toward him in surprise. "You speak English?" The boy gave a small nod. "Little. Traders taught." Martha smiled. "That would make things much easier. Do you believe your father can find you?" Tasha's looked at the sky and then toward the horizon. "Father best tracker. He find us." That evening, while Martha showed Nomi how to make small dolls from scraps of cloth, they heard a noise outside. Tasha's stiffened and hurried to the window. "Riders," he said tensely. A chill traveled down Martha's spine. Unknown riders rarely brought good news to an isolated cabin. They might be Comanche searching for the children, but they could just as easily be outlaws taking advantage of the loneliness left behind by the storm. "Stay here," Martha ordered. She took her late husband's rifle from above the fireplace and moved carefully toward the window. In the distance, 3 riders were approaching at a slow pace. 2 wore cowboy hats. The third, riding in front, was clearly native. His long hair was decorated with feathers, and he rode without a saddle. "Tasha's, come look," Martha called. The boy hurried over. The moment he recognized the lead rider, his eyes lit up. "Father," he cried, running for the door. Martha caught him before he could open it. "Wait. We do not know who the others are." But Tasha's was certain. "Friends." "Good." Martha hesitated for several seconds. At last, she chose to trust him. She left the rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach, and stepped onto the porch with both children. Tasha's waved his arms wildly. The riders stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. The Comanche warrior studied the scene for several long seconds. Even from that distance, Martha could feel the force of his gaze. He was tall and powerfully built, his face marked by deep lines that spoke of a hard life on the plains. Tasha's shouted something in Comanche and ran toward them. The warrior leaped from his horse, rushed forward, dropped to his knees, and wrapped the boy in a desperate embrace. Nomi ran after him. Her father lifted her into his arms and held her tightly against his chest. The other 2 riders dismounted. One was an elderly Comanche man. The other, to Martha's surprise, was a white man with a weathered but friendly face. "Good afternoon," he said as he approached. "My name is James Cooper. I serve as an interpreter for Night Eagle's band." He gestured toward the warrior, who was now walking toward them with his children. "We have been searching for these little ones for several days." Martha nodded, though she was still somewhat tense. "I found them during the storm. They were nearly frozen. I am glad you came for them." The warrior stopped in front of Martha with Nomi in his arms and Tasha's beside him. His expression remained solemn, but the gratitude in his eyes was impossible to miss. Without looking away from her, he spoke in his own language. "Night Eagle says he owes you the lives of his children," Cooper translated. "To a Comanche, there is no debt more sacred." Martha felt heat rise into her cheeks. "Tell him anyone in my place would have done the same." Cooper translated her words. Night Eagle shook his head and answered firmly. "He says no. Many white people would have allowed 2 Comanche children to die, especially in times like these. He says you have a brave and honorable heart." Martha did not know how to respond. It was true that relations between settlers and native people were filled with fear, hatred, and suspicion. She also knew that many of her neighbors would condemn what she had done. "Please, come inside," she said at last. "You must be exhausted and hungry." Cooper smiled. "That is very kind of you. We have ridden without rest since the storm began." Night Eagle would not even stop to sleep. Inside the cabin, Martha made coffee and brought out freshly baked bread. Through Cooper, the elderly Comanche, who turned out to be the children's uncle, explained how they had become separated in the blizzard. He had searched for hours, but had finally been forced to return to camp before he froze to death himself. When Night Eagle learned what had happened, he gathered his best trackers and rode out immediately despite the heavy snowfall. "I have never known a more determined man," Cooper said. "He followed signs I could not even see beneath the ice. When the rest of us believed there was no hope left, he refused to turn back." Martha watched the warrior with his children. In front of the others, he maintained a controlled and dignified expression. Yet the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at Nomi, and the steady hand he kept on Tasha's shoulder, revealed a deeply loving father. "How did you come to work with them, Mr. Cooper?" Martha asked. The man smiled. "I was an Army scout many years ago. I learned their language and eventually earned their trust. Now I serve as a mediator whenever they must negotiate with white officials. Night Eagle is one of the last chiefs still living free. His band has not yet agreed to move to a reservation. Martha nodded. She had heard stories about groups that resisted confinement and would rather risk death than surrender their way of life. Is that not dangerous for them? Cooper gave a tired shrug. More dangerous every day. The buffalo are disappearing, and settlers continue to arrive. But Night Eagle is a wise man. He knows a time of great change is coming, and he wants his people to face it with dignity. As they spoke, Night Eagle watched Martha closely. At last, he said something to Cooper. He wants to know why a white woman lives alone in such dangerous country, the interpreter explained. Martha sighed. My husband died 3 years ago. We never had children. I chose to remain because I found freedom and peace here. After Cooper translated, Night Eagle inclined his head with respect and replied in a solemn voice. He says you possess the spirit of a Comanche, strong as the winter wind, but warm as the fire of a home. The words touched Martha more deeply than she expected. At that moment, Nomi walked over and offered her a tiny figure made from one of the scraps of cloth. It was rough, but the shape of a person could still be recognized. It seems you have made a friend, Cooper observed. Martha accepted the little figure carefully and smiled at the girl. Thank you, Nomi. It is beautiful. Nomi smiled and returned to her father. Night Eagle watched her with quiet pride. In that moment, Martha understood that something had changed forever. They were no longer strangers from opposing worlds. They were human beings joined by one simple act of shared compassion. The next morning, Martha woke at sunrise, as she always did. To her surprise, Night Eagle was already awake, sitting on the porch and watching the horizon turn pink and gold. Cooper, the old man, and the children were still asleep inside the cabin. Martha hesitated, then stepped outside and sat at a respectful distance from the warrior. He glanced at her and gave a small nod in acknowledgement. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They watched the sun rise slowly, melting snow from the pine branches, and creating tiny rainbows in the falling drops of water. Martha was surprised by how natural it felt to share the silence with him. Then, to her astonishment, Night Eagle spoke in simple, but understandable English. Good place, he said, gesturing toward the land. Strong spirit. Martha stared at him. You speak English? The warrior allowed himself a faint smile. Little. Listen much. Speak little. Why did you say nothing yesterday? Night Eagle looked directly into her eyes. Wanted to see heart first. Now I know. Martha nodded in understanding. He had wanted to observe her without letting her know that he could understand her words. It had been a shrewd test. Your children are wonderful, she said. Tasha's is very brave, and he protects his sister. Pride brightened the warrior's face. One day, great chief, like grandfather. And Nomi. Nomi like her mother. Strong, but gentle. Sees things others do not see. Martha noticed a shadow of grief in his eyes. Her mother died 2 winters ago, he added. Fever. I am so sorry, Martha said sincerely. My husband died of fever too. Night Eagle studied her with new understanding. Hard road alone. But makes strong. Yes, Martha agreed. It makes us strong. The sun had risen fully by then, flooding the snow-covered land with brilliant light. Sounds of movement began inside the cabin. I should prepare breakfast, Martha said as she stood. Night Eagle rose as well. Before she reached the door, he touched her arm lightly to stop her. Thank you, he said with an intensity far greater than the words themselves. For my children. Life for life. The honesty of his gratitude tightened Martha's throat. It was nothing. The warrior shook his head. For a father, it is everything. Everything. During breakfast, Cooper announced that they needed to leave soon if they hoped to reach the camp before nightfall. The snow had begun to melt, and the journey would still be difficult, but waiting any longer could be dangerous. Army patrols may be watching this area, he explained. It would be best to avoid any encounter. Martha understood the urgency. Although open warfare had ended, tension remained, and a free Comanche band like Night Eagles would be viewed with suspicion by military authorities. While the men prepared the horses, Martha gathered provisions for the journey: bread, dried meat, and several jars of preserved fruit she had saved for winter. She also wrapped an extra blanket for Nomi, worried about the cold the little girl would have to endure on the trail. Tasha's watched closely as she packed everything. Will we see each other again? He asked in his limited English. The question touched Martha deeply. I do not know, Tasha's. You live very far away. The boy appeared to consider this seriously. When I am warrior, I come back. I protect you. Martha smiled and, acting on impulse, pulled him into an embrace. You will be a great warrior. I am certain of it. When everything was ready, the visitors gathered in front of the cabin to say goodbye. Cooper shook Martha's hand with genuine respect. You have done something extraordinary, Mrs. Wilkins. Not many people in your position would have taken in 2 Comanche children. I only did what any decent person would have done, she replied. Cooper smiled sadly. That is what people always say about true acts of kindness. But the truth is, not everyone would have done it. The elderly man stepped forward and, to Martha's surprise, offered her a small leather pouch. What is it? She asked as she accepted it. Medicine, Cooper translated. Special herbs used by Comanche healers during winter. He says they will keep evil spirits away from your home. Martha thanked the old man with a respectful bow of her head. Then it was the children's turn. Nomi ran to her and held her tightly, whispering words in Comanche that Martha could not understand, but whose meaning she could feel. Take care of yourself, little one, Martha said, kissing her forehead. Grow strong and brave. Finally, Night Eagle approached. His expression was solemn, though restrained emotion showed in his eyes. Without a word, he removed a necklace from around his neck. It was a simple leather cord holding a polished wolf fang. For protection, he said, placing it in Martha's hand. Wolf guides through darkness, as you guided my children. Martha stared at the necklace, deeply moved by the meaning behind the gift. I cannot accept this. It must be important to you. Now important to you, he replied. Memory and promise. What promise? The warrior held her gaze. Comanche never forgets life debt. If you ever need help, send Fang. Night Eagle will come. Martha understood the solemn weight of the promise. She placed the necklace around her neck and felt the fang settle against her chest. I will wear it with honor. The riders mounted. Night Eagle seated Nomi in front of him while Tasha's climbed onto Cooper's horse. Before leaving, the warrior looked at Martha one last time. Your spirit now lives in my children, he said. You will never be alone. Then he urged his horse forward and started west. The others followed. Martha remained on the porch, watching until they became tiny, nearly invisible shapes in the distance. The wolf fang necklace felt warm against her skin, like a living promise that 2 very different worlds could remain connected. That night, as she watched the stars from her porch, Martha thought about the strange turns of fate. She could never have imagined that a blizzard would bring 2 Comanche children and their warrior father to her door. Something inside her had changed. Loneliness, which had been her constant companion for years, no longer felt so crushing. Far away, a wolf howled beneath the clear night sky. Martha touched the fang at her neck and smiled. Perhaps, after all, she was not as alone as she had believed. 3 weeks later, Martha received an unexpected visitor. Walter Peterson, the owner of the settlement's general store, arrived with supplies and news. "People are talking, Mrs. Wilkins," he said as he unloaded sacks of flour. "They say you helped some Indians during the storm." Martha tensed, but her voice remained calm. "And what if I did?" Peterson looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Some people will not approve. These are dangerous times, especially with all the stories about attacks on settlements farther west." "They were children," Martha interrupted firmly. "Frightened children lost in a storm. I did not care whether they were white, black, or native. I could not let them die." The man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You have always been different, Mrs. Wilkins. I suppose that is why you are still out here when anyone else would have left long ago." As Peterson finished unloading the supplies, he noticed the necklace around Martha's neck. "That is a fine piece," he remarked. "It does not look like anything we sell in town." Martha touched the wolf fang and smiled. "It was a gift from a friend." That night, she wrote in her journal for the first time in months. She described meeting the Comanche children, their father's determination, and the promises they had exchanged. When she finished, she realized she was crying, though the tears were not born of sadness. For the first time in years, she felt hope. In a world divided by fear and prejudice, she had experienced a moment of true human connection. Outside, spring was beginning to announce its arrival. The first green shoots pushed through patches of snow still clinging to the ground. Martha knew that frontier life would remain harsh, but she now faced it with a renewed sense of purpose. Wherever they were, some part of her traveled with those Comanche children and their warrior father. Summer came in full force to the Texas frontier. The days grew long and scorching, and the prairie surrounding Martha's cabin filled with wildflowers. Nearly half a year had passed since her meeting with Night Eagle and his children, yet scarcely a day went by without her thinking of them. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, tending the garden and animals, repairing fences, and preparing for another winter. Still, something in Martha had changed. Her neighbors noticed it whenever she rode into town for supplies. There was a new determination in her eyes, a quiet confidence she had not possessed before. "You look different, Mrs. Wilkins," the pastor's wife remarked one Sunday afternoon after church. "As though you finally found what you had been searching for." Martha smiled and unconsciously touched the wolf fang she still wore beneath the high collar of her dress. "Perhaps I did, Mrs. Johnson. Perhaps I did." One especially hot day in July, while Martha gathered vegetables from the garden, she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. She straightened, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and narrowed her eyes against the blazing sun. 3 riders were coming toward the property. Martha's heart began to beat faster when she recognized the formation: 1 white man, and 2 native riders, one clearly younger than the other. "It cannot be," she whispered. She dropped the basket of vegetables and hurried to the front of the cabin. When the riders entered the clearing, her suspicion was confirmed. James Cooper rode beside Night Eagle and Tasha's, who seemed to have grown several inches during the months since she had last seen him. "Mrs. Wilkins," Cooper called as he dismounted with practiced ease. "I hope our visit is not an inconvenience." "Of course not," Martha exclaimed, unable to hide her joy. "This is a wonderful surprise." Night Eagle dismounted and helped Tasha's down. The warrior inclined his head in respectful greeting. His face was as solemn as Martha remembered, but his eyes held unmistakable warmth. "Martha," he said, pronouncing her name carefully. "Night Eagle," she replied, inclining her head in return. "Tasha's, welcome back to my home." Far less reserved than his father, the boy ran to her and threw his arms around her. "I missed you," he said in noticeably improved English. "Look how much I grew." Martha laughed, touched by his excitement. "You certainly did. Before long, you will be as tall as your father." "That is the plan," Tasha's answered proudly. Then Martha noticed that Nomi was not with them. "Where is your sister?" "She stayed with the women at the camp," Cooper explained. "The journey was too long for her. Night Eagle decided it would be better for her to remain there." Martha nodded, though she could not hide a trace of disappointment. She would have loved to see how much the little girl had grown. "Please, come inside," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "You must be tired and thirsty." Once they were inside, Martha served fresh water and quickly prepared a meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. As they ate, Cooper explained the reason for their visit. "We came to bring you news," he said. "Night Eagle's band has finally decided to move to a reservation in Indian Territory." Martha looked at the warrior in surprise. "I thought you would rather die free." Night Eagle nodded slowly. "Time changes. People change. Children need future." Martha understood how difficult the decision must have been. For a warrior as proud as Night Eagle, accepting life on a reservation must have been deeply painful. "It is a brave choice," she said sincerely. "You are putting your children first." Night Eagle held her gaze. "You taught. When you saved children, you showed path. Sometimes pride must step aside so life can continue." Martha felt her throat tighten. She had never imagined that her actions could have influenced the warrior's decision so profoundly. Before leaving for the reservation, Cooper continued, "Night Eagle insisted on coming to see you. He said he still had a debt that needed to be honored." The warrior rose and briefly stepped outside. When he returned, he carried an object wrapped in deerskin. He placed it carefully on the table and removed the covering. It was a beautiful leather quiver, skillfully made and decorated with colored beads and eagle feathers. Inside rested several arrows tipped with flint. Every piece had been carved with extraordinary care. "For protection," Night Eagle explained. "Sacred arrows, blessed by Healer. No enemy will enter your home." Martha stared at the gift, overwhelmed by its beauty and meaning. "It is far too valuable. I cannot accept it." "You must," the warrior insisted. "You saved Comanche future. Comanche never forgets." Martha realized that refusing the gift would insult his honor. At last, she nodded. "I will treasure it as one of my most precious possessions." Tasha's, who had watched the exchange with obvious emotion, reached into his bag. He drew out a small wooden carving of a woman standing beside two children. "I made it," he said proudly as he handed it to her. "So you do not forget." Martha accepted the figure, deeply moved. "It is beautiful, Tasha's. You have a true gift." The boy smiled at the praise. "When I grow up, I will visit you again. I will bring Nomi." Martha looked toward Night Eagle, wondering whether he would permit such a promise. To her surprise, the warrior nodded. "My children will always remember road to this place," he said. Here they learned not every pale face has cold heart. The conversation continued as afternoon moved toward sunset. Martha learned that the band would not travel directly to the reservation. They would first spend some time near Fort Sill, where Night Eagle would serve as a scout for the army. Cooper had helped negotiate the arrangement, allowing the Comanche to preserve some dignity while they adjusted to their new life. It will not be easy, Cooper admitted. The times are changing too quickly. The railroad keeps advancing, settlers arrive by the thousands, and the old life of the plains is disappearing. It will not disappear completely, Martha said with conviction. Not as long as there are people who remember and respect their traditions. Night Eagle looked at her with approval. You speak wisdom. White or red skin not important. Respect for land, respect for life, that must remain. When the time came to part, Martha felt a sadness she had not expected. She had grown deeply attached to these visitors from a world so different from her own. On the porch, while the men prepared the horses, Tasha's approached her. I have message from Nomi, he said. He pulled a small bracelet woven from colored threads from his bag. She made this for you. Says it will protect you as you protected her. Martha slipped the bracelet around her wrist and admired its intricate pattern. Tell her I will always wear it. And tell her I hope to see her again someday. Cooper said goodbye with a firm handshake. It has been an honor to know you, Mrs. Wilkins. People like you allow the rest of us to keep faith in the future of this land. Finally, Night Eagle stepped closer. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, two souls that had discovered common ground despite the enormous differences that seemed to divide them. World changes, the warrior said. But some things remain, honor, respect, memory. I never forget woman who saved my children. Tears filled Martha's eyes. And I will never forget the father who rode for days through a blizzard to find them. Night Eagle bowed his head. Then, in an unexpected gesture, he extended his hand. Martha took it, feeling the strength and warmth of that simple human contact. Until we meet again, he said. Until then, Martha replied. The three riders mounted and began their journey. They raised their hands in one final farewell before disappearing among the trees. Martha remained on the porch long after they vanished from sight, the wolf fang resting against her chest and Nomi's bracelet around her wrist. When she returned inside, she carefully placed the quiver of sacred arrows and the figure carved by Tasha's in a place of honor above the fireplace. Then she sat down to write in her journal, determined to preserve every detail of that extraordinary day. Today I understood, she wrote, that the most important frontiers are not those dividing one land from another, but those separating human hearts. And those frontiers can be crossed through one simple act of kindness. Years would pass. Borders would change. Railroads, cities, and roads would transform the Great Plains forever. Yet in a small cabin beside the Brazos River, one woman would always preserve the memory of two children lost in the snow and the warrior, who rode for days to thank her for saving their lives. And somewhere in Indian territory, a proud Comanche warrior would tell his grandchildren the story of a white woman with a courageous heart, who taught them that our shared humanity can overcome the barriers of fear and distrust. Two different worlds had been joined forever by an invisible bridge of gratitude and mutual respect. And that story, like the plains themselves, would live on through the changing seasons of time.